They thought she was just another tech CEO, and the quiet man restocking the vending machines was just a maintenance worker. They couldn't have been more wrong. What happened next would stop a room full of industry leaders dead in their tracks, save a woman's life, and create a moment so powerful it would break the internet within hours. When assassins cornered Celia DeMar at the prestigious Whitmore Summit in downtown Seattle, they had no idea that Lucien Aurival, the man they dismissed as invisible help, carried skills that most people only see in movies. They had no idea about the tragedy that connected their paths years before. And they definitely had no idea that what Celia would say afterward would move millions to tears and change both their lives forever. Before we dive in, if you believe in stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things when it matters most, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. What unfolded that night would remind the world that heroes hide in the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Crystal Towers Convention Center in downtown Seattle had never hosted an event quite like the Whitmore Technology Summit. Glass and steel stretched 40 stories into the Pacific Northwest sky, its facade reflecting the city lights like a beacon for the most powerful minds in tech. Tonight, the top-floor ballroom hummed with the electric energy of billion-dollar deals being whispered over champagne and the soft murmur of conversations that could reshape entire industries. Celia DeMar stood near the panoramic windows, her silhouette elegant against the Seattle skyline. As CEO of Nexus Dynamics, she commanded attention without demanding it. Her midnight blue dress was tailored to perfection, her auburn hair swept back in a style that spoke of confidence earned through years of fighting for her place in rooms where she was often the only woman. At 34, she had built her artificial intelligence company from a garage startup into a multinational corporation worth $3 billion. But tonight, success felt more like a target painted on her back. The men surrounding her wore expensive suits that couldn't quite mask the predatory gleam in their eyes. Valentino Ordric led the pack, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile containing all the warmth of a winter storm. Behind him stood executives from Titan Corp, the massive conglomerate that had been circling Nexus Dynamics like vultures for months. "Celia, darling," Valentino said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "The offer on the table is more than generous. Your shareholders would be thrilled." Celia's fingers tightened around the champagne flute she held, but her voice remained steady. "My company isn't for sale, Valentino. Not to you, not to anyone. Come now," he continued, stepping closer. "Nexus Dynamics has hit some rough waters lately. The congressional hearings about AI ethics, the media scrutiny about data privacy. Wouldn't it be easier to let someone else handle those headaches?" Around the ballroom, other conversations continued, but Celia felt increasingly isolated. The tech journalists mingled with venture capitalists, their cameras and phones ready to capture the next big story. Hotel staff moved efficiently through the crowd, refilling glasses and clearing plates. Security guards in black suits stood at strategic positions, but their attention seemed focused on keeping uninvited guests out, not protecting invited ones from each other. Near the service corridor that led to the kitchens, a maintenance worker quietly checked the locks on a utility closet. Lucien Aurival wore the standard-issue gray uniform of Pinnacle Building Services, his name embroidered in simple blue thread above the breast pocket. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands, he looked exactly like what he was supposed to be: invisible help, the kind of person who kept the building running, while the important people conducted their important business. But appearances, as they often do, told only the smallest part of the story. Lucien had been working the night shift at Crystal Towers for 8 months now, ever since he'd moved to Seattle with his 8-year-old daughter, Saphira. The job paid enough to cover their modest apartment in the Belltown district and Saphira's private school tuition. More importantly, it kept him out of the spotlight, away from the kind of attention that had followed him out of the Navy SEALs. 3 years earlier, he moved through his rounds with practiced efficiency, checking emergency exits, testing the backup power systems, ensuring that the building's sophisticated security measures were functioning perfectly. Most people looked right through him, which was exactly how he preferred it. The maintenance uniform was better than any camouflage he'd ever worn in the field. From across the ballroom, Lucian's trained eye caught the subtle tension in Celia Damar's posture. He'd been watching the interaction for the past 10 minutes, noting how the men around her had gradually formed a tighter circle, how their body language had shifted from persuasive to aggressive. It was a pattern he recognized, the way predators isolated their prey. Celia tried to step away from the group, but Valentino's associate, a thick-necked man with cold eyes, moved to block her path. "Ms. Damar," the man said, his voice low enough that nearby conversations wouldn't be interrupted. "Mr. Ordrich's patience isn't unlimited. Perhaps you should reconsider your position." "My position is clear," Celia replied, her CEO mask firmly in place despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Nexus dynamics will remain independent." Valentino's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Independence is such a fragile thing, Celia. Companies can face all sorts of unexpected challenges. Cyber attacks, regulatory investigations, unfortunate accidents involving key personnel. The tech world can be so dangerous for those who don't have the right protection." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but Celia felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced around the ballroom, looking for all eyes, for witnesses, for anyone who might intervene. The other executives were deep in their own conversations. The journalists focused on their interviews, the security guards maintaining their positions by the exits. Near the service area, Lucian continued his work, but his attention was now fully focused on the conversation. Across the room, his hearing, sharpened by years of training, picked up enough of the exchange to understand what was happening. He'd seen corporate intimidation before, but this felt different. More dangerous. Saphira was at a sleepover tonight with her best friend from school, which meant Lucian didn't have to rush home after his shift. It also meant that if trouble started, he wouldn't be distracted by worry about getting back to her. Not that he expected trouble. He'd left that life behind when he hung up his uniform and picked up a maintenance toolkit. But old habits died hard, and the instincts that had kept him alive through 6 deployments were screaming that something was wrong. Celia tried once more to leave the circle, but now there were 6 men around her, and their formation had shifted from casual to deliberate. They weren't just making a business pitch anymore. They were making a statement about what happened to people who didn't play along with Valentino Ordrich's plans. "I think this conversation is over," Celia said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "Oh, darling," Valentino replied, his tone turning patronizing. "I'm afraid it's just beginning." Across the ballroom, Lucian Orival set down his clipboard and began walking toward the group. He moved with the same casual efficiency he'd used for his maintenance rounds, just another worker doing his job. But his route was calculated, his pace deliberate, and his eyes were already identifying potential threats and escape routes. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them saw coming. 2 hours earlier, Lucian Orival had been sitting in the cramped break room on the 32nd floor of Crystal Towers, sharing a quiet dinner with his daughter before the evening shift began. Saphira sat across from him at the small formica table, her backpack shaped like a purple dragon beside her chair, working on math homework while he ate a sandwich from the brown bag he packed every night. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson says I'm the best in the class of fractions," Saphira announced, looking up from her worksheet with the kind of pride that made Lucian's chest tight with emotion. "That's because you get your brain from your mom," he replied, reaching over to ruffle her dark hair. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and curiosity, but she had his stubborn determination and his ability to stay calm under pressure. "I get my stubbornness from you," she shot back with a grin that was pure mischief. "That's not stubbornness, kiddo. That's persistence. There's a difference." Saphira rolled her eyes in the way that 8-year-olds had perfected since the beginning of time. "Whatever you say, Dad." The break room was utilitarian and impersonal, with fluorescent lights that hummed slightly and windows that looked out over the Seattle streets below. It wasn't much, but it had become their routine. 3 nights a week, Saphira would come with him to Crystal Towers after school, finish her homework in the break room, then catch a ride with Jenny, one of the day shift cleaning supervisors, to whatever sleepover or playdate she had scheduled. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it was their arrangement. Single parenting required flexibility, creativity, and a willingness to make unconventional solutions work. Lucian had learned to excel at all 3. "Dad," Saphira said, her voice taking on the serious tone she used when she was thinking about big things, "do you ever miss your old job?" The question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. She asked it occasionally, usually when she sensed he was restless or when she heard other adults talking about careers and ambitions and 5-year plans. "Sometimes," he answered honestly. "But I like this job better. Because it's safer. Because it lets me be here with you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She seemed satisfied with that answer, returning to her fractions while he finished his sandwich. The truth was more complicated, of course. Lucian missed the brotherhood of the teams, the clear sense of purpose, the feeling that his skills were being used to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But he didn't miss the deployments that took him away from Saphira for months at a time, or the operations that required him to do things that still visited his dreams. His phone buzzed with a text from Jenny confirming pickup time, and Saphira gathered her books and stuffed them into the dragon backpack. "Okay, Dad, I'm ready for the sleepover. Emma's mom is making her famous chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast." "Lucky you," Lucian said, walking her to the elevator. "Remember the rules? Be polite, help clean up, and call you if anything feels wrong," she recited. And remember that you love me even when I'm not with you. Especially when you're not with you," he corrected, giving her a hug that lasted just a moment longer than she probably expected. After Jenny and Saphira left, Lucian changed into his work uniform and began his evening rounds. Crystal Towers was a massive building, 40 floors of offices, conference rooms, executive suites, and event spaces. The Whitmore Technology Summit was the biggest event they'd hosted all year, bringing together CEOs, investors, journalists, and politicians from across the country. Lucian's job was to ensure that everything ran smoothly from the infrastructure side. Check the VAFX systems, test the backup generators, verify that all emergency systems were operational, and remain invisible while doing it. He was good at being invisible. It was a skill that had served him well both in the military and in civilian life. The building security system was sophisticated, with cameras covering every angle and access controls that required key cards for different levels of clearance. Lucian had a master maintenance card that could get him almost anywhere, but he used it respectfully, understanding that with access came responsibility. By 8 o'clock, the summit was in full swing on the 40th floor. Lucian could hear the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses through the sound system that fed into the maintenance areas. The building's acoustic design meant that he could monitor events without being intrusive, ensuring that technical problems could be addressed before they became noticeable to the guests. He'd been doing security sweeps since 6, checking every access point, every service entrance, every potential vulnerability. It was more thorough than the job required, but old habits were hard to break. In the SEALs, Preparation wasn't just professional, it was survival. That's when he first noticed the irregularities. 3 men in expensive suits had arrived separately from the main group of summit attendees. They'd used a service elevator instead of the main lifts, and they'd entered the building through the loading dock rather than the lobby. Their credentials checked out when security scanned them, but something about their movement pattern set off alarm bells in Lucian's head. He'd spent enough years reading people to recognize when someone was carrying concealed weapons, even when they were trying to hide it. The slight bulk under a jacket, the way someone moved their shoulders to accommodate a shoulder holster, the unconscious habit of checking their waistband, all tells that most people wouldn't notice, but that screamed trouble to anyone with the right training. Lucian made a mental note of their faces and positions, then continued his rounds. It wasn't his job to provide security for the event. That was handled by the professional team that Whitmore Industries had hired. His job was to keep the building running. But the protective instincts that had been drilled into him over 8 years of military service were hard to ignore. By 9:30, the summit was hitting its stride. Lucian had completed his standard checklist and was working on the extra security measures he'd added to his routine. That's when he saw Celia DeMar for the first time. She stood near the windows, a striking figure against the Seattle skyline. But what caught his attention wasn't her appearance, it was her body language. She held herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, but there was tension in her shoulders, wariness in the way she scanned the room. Lucian had seen that same expression on the faces of assets in hostile territory. People who knew they were being watched but weren't sure by whom or why. Then, Valentino Ordric approached her, and the pieces began falling into place. Lucian recognized Ordric from the business news, though he'd never paid much attention to corporate drama. But the way Ordric moved, the way his associates positioned themselves, the subtle shift in the room's energy, it all felt familiar in the worst possible way. This wasn't just a business meeting. This was a setup, the conversation between Celia DeMar and Valentino Ordric had been going on for 20 minutes now, and Lucian could see it escalating from his position near the service corridor. What had started as corporate schmoozing had evolved into something much more dangerous, and the other summit attendees seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. Celia tried again to excuse herself from the conversation, but the circle of men around her had tightened imperceptibly. To a casual observer, it might have looked like an animated business discussion, but Lucian's trained eye saw it for what it was, a trap closing around its prey. "I'm afraid I need to check in with my team," Celia said, her voice maintaining its professional composure despite the growing tension. "Your team can wait," Valentino replied, his smile never wavering. "We're at a critical point in our negotiations." "We're not negotiating," Celia responded firmly. "I've made my position clear." That's when Lucian saw one of Ordric's associates reach inside his jacket. The movement was subtle, practiced, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years learning to recognize threats. The man's hand came to rest on what Lucian was certain was the grip of a concealed pistol. The situation had just crossed from corporate intimidation to something much more serious. Lucian began moving across the ballroom, his path carefully calculated to look like routine maintenance work. He carried a small toolkit and a tablet computer, props that would explain his presence anywhere in the building. But his route was bringing him steadily closer to Celia and her increasingly aggressive business associates. "Ms. DeMar," Valentino continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you're misunderstanding the nature of our relationship. This isn't a request, it's an inevitability." "The only inevitable thing here," Celia replied, "is that this conversation is over." She turned to leave, but the thick-necked associate stepped directly into her path. The movement was smooth and appeared casual, but it effectively blocked her exit route. Anyone watching from across the room would see nothing more than a group of people having an intense discussion. "Excuse me," Celia said, her voice carrying a note of steel that suggested she wasn't intimidated easily. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man replied. Not moving aside, that's when Lucian made his decision. He'd spent 3 years trying to live a quiet life, staying out of trouble, keeping his head down, focusing on being the kind of father Saphira deserved. He'd walked away from the military precisely because he was tired of violence, tired of making split-second decisions about life and death, tired of carrying the weight of other people's safety on his shoulders. But some instincts were stronger than good intentions. "Excuse me," Lucian said, approaching the group with the deferential posture of a maintenance worker who needed to interrupt important people. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to check the climate control system behind this wall panel." Valentino turned to look at him, his expression shifting from annoyance to dismissive contempt in the space of a heartbeat. "Can't this wait? We're conducting important business here." "I'm afraid not, sir," Lucian replied, his voice apologetic but firm. "There's been a temperature fluctuation reported in this section, and it could affect the entire floor's climate system if I don't address it immediately." It was a complete fabrication, of course, but it was delivered with the kind of technical confidence that made civilians reluctant to argue. Lucian had learned long ago that people rarely questioned maintenance workers who spoke with authority about building systems. The thick-necked associate who had been blocking Celia's path turned toward Lucian with undisguised irritation. "Look, buddy, why don't you come back in an hour when the adults are finished talking?" "I understand your frustration, sir," Lucian replied calmly, "but building safety regulations require immediate attention to climate control issues. I'll be as quick as possible." He stepped forward, creating just enough disruption in the group's formation to give Celia an opening. She took it immediately, moving toward the wall where Lucian was supposedly going to work on the climate system. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. "Just doing my job, ma'am," Lucian replied, but his eyes were already scanning the room for additional threats. That's when he saw them. The 3 men he'd noticed earlier were moving through the crowd, their positions calculated to control the room's exit points. One had stationed himself near the main elevator banks, another had taken position by the emergency stairwell, and the third was working his way toward the service corridor that Lucian had been using for his rounds. This wasn't just corporate intimidation anymore. This was a coordinated operation. Valentino's facade finally cracked, his smooth smile disappearing as he realized his carefully orchestrated pressure campaign had been interrupted by a maintenance worker. "Security," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "We have a situation here." But the security guards Lucian had noted earlier were nowhere to be seen. In fact, as he scanned the room more carefully, he realized that several key positions were now unmanned. The professional security team that had been monitoring the event had been systematically removed or neutralized. Celia seemed to realize the same thing at the same moment. "Where is everyone?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Good question," Lucian replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his toolkit. Hidden among the legitimate maintenance tools were items that most building engineers didn't carry, items left over from his previous career that he'd never quite been able to throw away. The thick-necked associate stepped closer, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal the shoulder holster that Lucian had suspected was there. "I think you've helped enough for one evening," the man said, his hand moving toward his weapon. That's when everything changed. Lucian's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. His left hand shot out, grabbing the associate's wrist before the man could clear his holster. At the same time, his right hand delivered a precise strike to a nerve cluster just below the man's elbow. The associate's fingers went numb instantly, and his weapon clattered to the floor. Before the gun had finished falling, Lucian had already pivoted, using the associate's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby cocktail table. Crystal glasses exploded across the marble floor, and the sound cut through the ballroom's conversation like a gunshot. The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every camera phone in the room began recording. Valentino stared at the maintenance worker who had just taken down his armed associate with movements so fast and precise they seemed almost choreographed. The other men in his group began reaching for their own weapons, but they moved with the slow deliberation of people who weren't used to violence happening right in front of them. Lucian had been waiting for violence his entire adult life. "Ma'am," he said to Celia, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, "I think it would be best if you stayed behind me." Celia nodded, her mind still processing what she'd just witnessed. The quiet maintenance worker who had politely interrupted their conversation had just neutralized an armed man with movements that belonged in an action movie, not a corporate ballroom. "Who are you?" she whispered. Lucian's eyes were scanning the room, tracking the positions of Valentino's remaining associates and the three men, who were now moving more aggressively through the crowd. "Right now," he replied, "I'm the person standing between you and some very bad people." The evening had just taken a turn that none of them had seen coming, but one that Lucian Orival had been unconsciously preparing for his entire life. The sound of shattering crystal had cut through the ballroom like a blade, and in the sudden silence that followed, Lucian could hear everything with crystalline clarity. The sharp intake of breath from nearby guests, the whisper of expensive fabric as people turned to stare, the soft electronic chime of smartphones beginning to record, and underneath it all, the subtle sounds that most people would never notice. The soft scrape of concealed weapons being drawn, the measured breathing of trained operatives, the almost inaudible communications device crackling in someone's ear. Celia stood behind him, her body radiating shock and confusion, but she had the presence of mind to stay quiet and let him assess the situation. That told him something important about her character. She might be a corporate executive, but she understood when to trust someone else's expertise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Valentino announced to the room, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives, "I apologize for the disturbance. We seem to have encountered a delusional individual who believes he's some sort of action hero. Security will handle this shortly." But Lucian had already counted at least 7 armed men in the room, and the legitimate security team was nowhere to be found. This wasn't a spontaneous escalation. This was a planned operation that had been set in motion long before tonight's summit. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Celia, "I need you to listen very carefully. This isn't just about your company. These people are here to kill you, and they've eliminated the real security team to make it happen." Celia's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen operations like this before," Lucian replied, his eyes never leaving the approaching threats. "And because the man who just tried to draw a weapon on you isn't corporate security, he's military trained. Probably special forces, based on his movement patterns." 2 of Valentino's associates were flanking them now, moving with the coordinated precision of a practiced team. The guests between them and Lucian were beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong, and the first screams were starting to echo through the ballroom. "The emergency exits?" Celia asked. "Covered," Lucian replied. "They've positioned men to control every way out. This isn't corporate intimidation. This is an assassination." That's when the first shot was fired. It came from one of the men Lucian had identified earlier. Aimed not at him but at Celia. The shooter had calculated that eliminating the target would end the confrontation before it could escalate further. He hadn't calculated on Lucian's reflexes. Lucian moved with a speed that seemed to bend physics, sweeping Celia off her feet and diving behind a marble pillar as the bullet shattered a champagne flute where her head had been a microsecond before. The sound of the gunshot sent the ballroom into immediate chaos, with guests screaming and diving for cover while others pulled out their phones to document what they thought was some sort of staged entertainment. "Stay low," Lucian commanded, positioning himself between Celia and the shooters. From his toolkit, he produced items that definitely weren't standard maintenance equipment: a combat knife, a compact pistol, and what looked like a small explosive device. Celia stared at the weapons in shock. "What kind of maintenance worker are you?" "The kind who used to do a very different job," Lucian replied, checking the pistol's magazine with practiced efficiency. "Navy SEALs Team 6, 8 years, 6 deployments. Retired 3 years ago to raise my daughter." The revelation hung in the air between them for a moment as bullets shattered marble inches from their heads. "So when you said you'd seen operations like this before, double quotes, Celia began. "I meant I've run operations like this before," Lucian finished. "The difference is, I was usually on the other side." Another volley of gunfire forced them deeper behind cover. Lucian could hear the tactical communications between the shooters. They were coordinating their approach, trying to flank the pillar from both sides. Professional, but not as professional as they thought they were. "How many?" Celia asked, her CEO composure cracking as the reality of their situation sank in. "7 that I can see, probably more in reserve," Lucian replied, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "They've planned this carefully, waited until most of the legitimate security was off duty, positioned themselves to control the exits, created a scenario where your death could be blamed on random violence or corporate espionage gone wrong." "But why? My company is successful, but it's not worth killing for." Lucian glanced at her, his expression grim. "What kind of AI does Nexus Dynamics develop?" "Predictive algorithms mostly. Financial modeling, supply chain optimization, some military applications for logistics, and—" She stopped mid-sentence, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Military applications," Lucian repeated. "Let me guess, your algorithms could revolutionize warfare logistics, maybe even drone targeting systems?" Celia nodded slowly. "We've been working with several defense contractors on prototype development. The Pentagon has expressed interest in our next-generation battlefield management system." "Then this isn't about buying your company," Lucian said, popping up briefly to return fire and forcing 2 of the shooters back behind cover. "This is about preventing that technology from reaching the American military. Valentino Ordric isn't just a corporate raider. He's working for someone who has a very different agenda. The pieces were falling into place now. Celia's assassination would be blamed on corporate espionage. Her company would be vulnerable to hostile takeover, and the military applications of her AI technology would end up in the wrong hands. "The question is," Lucian continued, reloading his weapon with movements so smooth they seemed automatic, "who's paying Ordric to kill you?" Before Celia could answer, the tactical situation changed dramatically. The elevator doors opened, and 6 more armed men stepped into the ballroom, their weapons already drawn and their movements coordinating with the shooters already in position. 13 total now, Lucian muttered, running calculations in his head, plus whatever backup they have staged in the building. "Can you handle 13 men?" Celia asked, her voice tight with fear. Lucian allowed himself a small smile as he checked the explosive device from his toolkit, a flashbang grenade that he'd carried for 3 years, without ever expecting to use it. "Ma'am," he said, "on my worst day in the Navy SEALs, I was outnumbered 20 to 1. 13 corporate mercenaries who probably learned their tactics from YouTube videos. That's what we used to call a target-rich environment." He pulled the pin on the flashbang and tossed it toward the center of the room. "Cover your ears and close your eyes," he commanded. The explosion that followed would be heard 6 blocks away, and would mark the moment when Lucian Orivel stopped being a maintenance worker and became something much more dangerous. The flashbang detonated with a thunderclap that seemed to shake the entire 40th floor, its blinding white light turning the elegant ballroom into a scene from a war zone. In the 3 seconds of disorientation that followed, Lucian moved with lethal precision that spoke to years of training and combat experience that Corporate mercenaries simply couldn't match. He vaulted over the marble pillar, his body moving, in a controlled dive that brought him behind the nearest shooter. Before the man could recover from the flashbang's effects, Lucian had relieved him of his weapon and rendered him unconscious with a sleeper hold that dropped him silently to the marble floor. 2 weapons now. Better odds. The second shooter, partially recovered but still blinking away the afterimage of the explosion, swung his rifle toward where he thought Lucian should be. Instead, he found empty space and a combat knife that appeared in his peripheral vision for just a moment before the world went dark. "Stay behind the pillar," Lucian called to Celia, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't move until I come back for you." By now, the ballroom had descended into complete pandemonium. Guests were screaming, diving under tables, desperately trying to reach the exits that Lucian knew were already sealed. The sound of gunfire echoed off the glass walls, and someone had triggered the building's fire alarm system, adding its piercing wail to the cacophony. But for Lucian, the chaos was just background noise. His mind had shifted into the tactical state that had kept him alive through 6 combat deployments, time seeming to slow as his training took over completely. The third shooter had taken position behind the bar, using its marble face as cover while he tried to get a clear shot at the pillar where Celia was hidden. Lucian approached from his blind spot, using the panicking guests as concealment. The man never saw him coming. A precise strike to the carotid artery, and the shooter joined his companions in unconsciousness. 3 down. 10 to go. The remaining shooters were beginning to realize that their carefully planned operation was being systematically dismantled by a single maintenance worker who moved like a ghost and struck like lightning. Lucian could hear their tactical communications becoming increasingly frantic as they tried to re-establish control of the situation. "Target is military trained," one voice crackled through their comm system. "Repeat, target has professional combat skills. Requesting immediate backup from secondary team." Secondary team. That meant there were more shooters staged elsewhere in the building, probably in the stairwells or elevator shafts. The operation was larger than he'd initially estimated. Lucian made his way back toward Celia's position, moving in a crouch that kept him below the sight lines of the remaining shooters. She was exactly where he'd left her, pressed against the marble pillar with her arms wrapped around her knees, but her eyes were alert and tracking his movements. "How many more?" she whispered as he slid into cover beside her. 10 in here, unknown. Number elsewhere in the building, he replied, checking his remaining ammunition. "They're calling for backup, which means this was planned as a much larger operation than just what we're seeing in this room." Celia's face was pale, but her voice remained steady. "What do you need me to do? Right now? Stay alive and stay hidden. But I need you to think. Who else knows about your military contracts? Who would have access to tonight's event schedule? Who could have orchestrated replacing the legitimate security team?" Even as he spoke, Lucian was watching the tactical movements of the remaining shooters. They were good, better than the first 3 he'd eliminated. These men moved with the discipline of former special forces, communicating through hand signals when their radios weren't secure, maintaining overlapping fields of fire, advancing with careful coordination. "The military contracts are classified," Celia said, her mind racing through possibilities. "Only a handful of people at Nexus have access to that information. The Pentagon liaison, my head of development, my chief security officer." She stopped, her eyes widening with realization. "What?" Lucian prompted. "Jason Kelwick, my chief security officer. He's the one who recommended the security team for tonight's event. He said the regular company we use was already booked for another event." Lucian nodded grimly. "Inside job. That explains how they knew the building's layout, how they got past the initial security screening, how they knew exactly when and where to make their move." A fresh volley of gunfire shattered the marble near their heads, indicating that the shooters had regrouped and were preparing for a coordinated assault on their position. "They're going to try to flank us from both sides," Lucian observed, studying their movement patterns. "The pillar won't provide cover much longer. So what do we do?" Lucian smiled, and for a moment, Celia saw the ghost of the Navy SEAL he'd once been. "We stop playing defense and start playing offense." From his toolkit, he produced 2 more items that definitely weren't standard maintenance equipment: a length of climbing rope and what looked like a small electronic device. "What is that?" Celia asked. "The electronic device is a signal jammer. It'll cut their tactical communications for about 3 minutes. The rope ... He looked up at the crystal chandeliers suspended from the ballroom's vaulted ceiling. "Well, sometimes you have to get creative with your exit strategies." The sound of breaking glass came from multiple directions as the shooters began their coordinated advance. They were moving systematically, using the ballroom's architectural features for cover, advancing in a pattern that would allow them to converge on the pillar from 3 different angles simultaneously. "When I activate the jammer," Lucian said, securing the rope around his waist, "they're going to be confused for about 30 seconds before they adapt. That's our window." "Our window for what?" "For reminding them that there's a big difference between corporate mercenaries and someone who learned his trade in places where second place gets you killed." He activated the signal jammer, and immediately the tactical communications among the shooters dissolved into static. Lucian could see the moment of confusion as they lost coordination with each other and with whatever command structure was directing the operation. That was when he moved. Using the rope like a jungle vine, Lucian swung from their position behind the pillar to a point 30 feet away, landing behind 2 shooters who were advancing on what they thought was his position. Before they could turn to face this impossible new angle of attack, both men were down and disarmed. The remaining shooters were now firing at shadows. Their careful coordination dissolved into chaos as they tried to track a target who seemed to materialize from impossible angles, strike with surgical precision, and vanish back into the mayhem of the panicking crowd. But even as Lucian systematically eliminated the immediate threats, he could hear new dangers approaching. The building's elevators were moving, the stairwell doors were opening, and the sound of boots on marble was growing louder. The secondary team was arriving, and from the sound of it, they were bringing serious firepower. Celia, still pressed against the pillar, watched in fascination and terror as the maintenance worker she'd met 20 minutes ago moved through armed professionals like they were standing still. But even she could see that the odds were about to get much worse. The real battle was just beginning. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that seemed obscenely civilized given the chaos that had consumed the Crystal Tower's ballroom. 12 more armed operatives stepped into the room, their tactical gear making them look like soldiers rather than corporate mercenaries. But it was the man who walked in behind them that made Lucian's blood run cold. Colonel Victor Dreneth moved with the measured confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. His gray hair cropped military short, his steel blue eyes scanning the destruction with professional interest. He wore an expensive civilian suit, but everything about his bearing screamed career special forces. Lucian recognized him immediately, and with that recognition came a flood of memories that he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Well, Dreneth called out, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom despite the continuing chaos. "Lucian Oraval, I heard rumors that you'd gone soft, hiding behind a maintenance uniform and playing house with a little girl. But it seems old habits die hard." Celia looked between them, seeing the tension that had suddenly radiated from Lucian like heat from a furnace. "You know him?" "Yeah," Lucian replied, his voice carrying a weight that spoke to old wounds and unfinished business. "I know him." Dreneth stepped over the unconscious form of one of his fallen operatives, his expression showing mild disappointment rather than anger. You always were the best of your class, Oreval. Shame you couldn't see the bigger picture. The bigger picture, Lucian repeated, his weapons trained on the new arrivals, but knowing that the odds had just shifted dramatically against them. Is that what you called it when you sold classified intel to foreign governments? When you got good people killed for money? The pieces of an old puzzle were falling into place in Lucian's mind, connections he'd suspected but never been able to prove. 3 years ago, he'd been part of an operation in Eastern Europe that had gone catastrophically wrong. Intelligence had been compromised, positions had been betrayed, and 6 members of his team had died in what was supposed to be a routine extraction mission. The official investigation had blamed communication failures and bad luck, but Lucian had always suspected there was a traitor in their ranks, someone feeding information to the enemy. He'd never been able to identify who it was before he'd left the service, but now everything was becoming crystal clear. You were the leak, Lucian said, the certainty settling in his chest like lead. You sold out our position in Prague. You got Martinez, Thornton Williams, Davidson, Chun, and Reeves killed for a paycheck. Dreneth's smile was as cold as January rain. I prefer to think of it as maximizing the value of my expertise. The Pentagon was never going to pay me what I was worth. Private contractors, on the other hand, understand the true value of quality intelligence. Celia pressed herself further. Behind the pillar, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. The quiet maintenance worker who had saved her life was confronting a man who had apparently betrayed and killed American soldiers. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her own assassination attempt was just one piece of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle. And now you're working for Valentino Ordrich, Lucian continued, his tactical awareness tracking the positions of Dreneth's men, while he tried to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Mr. Ordrich is a businessman with vision, Dreneth replied. He understands that certain technologies are too valuable to remain in the hands of governments that lack the will to use them properly. Ms. DeMars, artificial intelligence systems could revolutionize warfare, but only if they're in the right hands. Whose hands? Celia called out, her CEO instincts demanding answers even in the middle of a firefight. Chinese military intelligence primarily, Dreneth answered with the casual tone of someone discussing stock options. Though we have several interested parties, your death tonight will create a power vacuum at Nexus Dynamics that Mr. Ordrich's shell companies will be well positioned to fill. Within 6 months, your AI technology will be serving a more lucrative market than the Pentagon could ever provide. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now. Celia's assassination wasn't just about eliminating a business rival, it was about stealing technology that could shift the balance of military power on a global scale. Her companies, AI systems, designed to help American forces coordinate logistics and strategy, would instead be used to target American interests around the world. 6 of my teammates died because you sold them out, Lucian said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Dreneth recognized from their shared past. And now you want to kill a woman whose only crime is building something that could protect American lives. Sentiment, Oreval, it was always your weakness. Dreneth gestured to his men, who began advancing with coordinated precision. You never understood that loyalty is just another commodity to be bought and sold. The highest bidder wins. But as the mercenaries advanced, something in the ballroom's dynamics shifted. The guests who had been cowering in terror began to realize that they were witnessing something far more significant than a corporate dispute gone violent. Smartphones were recording from every angle, and social media posts were already spreading beyond the confines of Crystal Towers. Lucian could see it happening in real time, the transformation from a contained operation to a public spectacle. Dreneth's carefully orchestrated assassination was being broadcast live to the world, and with each passing second, the pressure for a clean cover-up was becoming impossible to maintain. You made one mistake, Colonel, Lucian said, using Dreneth's military rank with deliberate emphasis. And what's that? You brought this fight to American soil, in front of American witnesses, against American citizens. Lucian's voice carried the conviction of someone who had sworn an oath to defend his country and had never forgotten the weight of those words. And you're about to learn why that was a very bad idea. The tactical situation was still overwhelmingly against them. 12 fresh operatives plus whatever backup Drenith had staged elsewhere in the building. But Lucian had two advantages. That money couldn't buy. He was fighting for something that mattered more than a paycheck, and he was fighting on his home turf. Somewhere in the building, he knew, Saphira was safe at her sleepover, probably asleep and dreaming of chocolate chip pancakes and weekend adventures. But the knowledge that men like Drenith existed in the world, that they would sell out there, own countrymen for profit, that they would kill innocent people to steal technology that could be used against everything he'd sworn to protect. That knowledge burned in his chest like a flame that no amount of gunfire could extinguish. "Celia," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, this isn't just about saving your company. This is about stopping technology that could be used to kill American soldiers from ending up in enemy hands." She nodded, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. "What do you need me to do?" Lucian smiled, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. "Hold on tight. And remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people the world never hears about, in places the history books never mention, for reasons that can't be reduced to headlines or sound bites." The storm that was about to break would test everything. Lucian Araval had learned in 8 years of military service and 3 years of trying to build a quiet life. But as he looked at the men who had betrayed their oaths and their country, he knew that some fights were worth having, regardless of the odds. What happened next would later be called the Battle of Crystal Towers, though no official military record would ever acknowledge it. Lucian Araval, outnumbered 15-1 and armed with nothing but his training, his determination, and the improvised weapons in a maintenance toolkit, began systematically dismantling an operation that had taken months to plan and millions of dollars to execute. He moved like water flowing around obstacles, like lightning finding the path of least resistance, like death itself dancing through the marble corridors of corporate America. Every motion was calculated, every strike was precise, and every second was bought with the kind of skill that only came from years of fighting battles, where the stakes were measured in lives rather than stock prices. The first wave of Drenith's operatives came at him in a coordinated assault that should have ended the confrontation in 30 seconds. Instead, it marked the beginning of a masterclass in close-quarters combat that would be analyzed by military tacticians for years to come. Lucian used the ballroom's architecture against his attackers, turning crystal chandeliers into swinging obstacles, marble pillars into cover, and the building's own security systems into weapons. When the fire suppression system activated, flooding the room with water and reducing visibility, he moved through the chaos like he'd been born in it. 3 operatives tried to corner him near the bar. They found themselves unconscious on the wet marble before they realized their mistake. 2 more attempted to flank him from opposite sides. They collided with each other instead of their target, victims of his ability to redirect their momentum and turn their coordination against them. But it was when Drenith's men brought out the heavy weapons that Lucian truly began to demonstrate why Navy SEALs were considered among the most elite warriors in the world. A shotgun blast shattered the mirror behind the bar where Lucian had been standing a microsecond before. The gunman was searching for his target when he felt the cold touch of steel against his throat. Lucian had somehow circled behind him in the space of a heartbeat. "Nothing personal," Lucian said quietly, applying a sleeper hold that dropped the man without permanent damage. "You're just working for the wrong side." From across the room, Drenith watched the systematic destruction of his carefully recruited team with growing disbelief. These weren't amateurs he was losing. They were experienced mercenaries, former Special Forces operatives who had fought in conflicts around the globe. Yet they were being handled like training dummies by a maintenance worker who moved with the fluid grace of someone who had transcended the normal limitations of human combat capability. "Impossible," Dreneth muttered, speaking into his radio. "Bring up the heavy team from the 20th floor. All of them." The elevator doors opened again, disgorging 8 more operatives equipped with military-grade weapons and tactical armor. The ballroom now looked like a war zone, with overturned tables, shattered glass, and unconscious mercenaries scattered across the marble floor like casualties from a battlefield. But in the center of it all, Lucian Araval stood calm and focused, protecting the woman who represented not just a business leader, but a symbol of American innovation and determination. He had positioned himself and Celia behind an overturned banquet table that provided minimal cover, but his stance suggested that he welcomed the escalation. 23 against 1 now, Celia whispered, her voice tight with fear but steady. "With determination." "How are you going to watch and learn?" Lucian replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced worse odds in places where backup was measured in hours rather than minutes. The heavy team advanced with military precision, their weapons trained on the overturned table. They moved in perfect formation, communicating through hand signals, covering each other's advance with overlapping fields of fire. They were professionals who had learned their trade in the world's most dangerous conflicts. They had never faced anyone like Lucian Araval. When he moved, it was with a speed that seemed to bend the laws of physics. He vaulted over the table, not away from his attackers, but directly toward them, closing the distance before they could adjust their weapons to track such an aggressive approach. The first operative tried to bring his rifle to bear, but found his weapon somehow tangled in the climbing rope that Lucian had used earlier. Before he could clear the obstruction, a precise strike to his solar plexus had dropped him to his knees. The second operative managed to fire a burst, but his shots hit empty air where Lucian had been rather than where he was. A combat knife appeared in the man's peripheral vision for just long enough to register. Before unconsciousness claimed him, the remaining 6 operatives tried to re-establish their formation, but Lucian was already inside their defensive perimeter, moving among them like a ghost. He used their own numbers against them, positioning himself so that their crossfire endangered each other rather than him. One by one, they fell. Not dead, Lucian was careful about that, using precise strikes that incapacitated without causing permanent damage, but removed from the equation with the kind of surgical efficiency that spoke to years of training and an intimate understanding of human anatomy. Throughout the ballroom, smartphones continued recording. Social media feeds were exploding with footage of what appeared to be a real-life action movie playing out in corporate America. The hashtags were already spreading. Hashtag Crystal Towers Battle, hashtag Maintenance Hero, hashtag Seattle Showdown. But for Lucian, the cameras and the internet fame were just background noise. His attention was focused on the tactical situation, on protecting Celia, and on the growing certainty that this confrontation was about far more than one woman's life or one company's. Technology. When the last of the heavy team had been neutralized, an eerie silence settled over the ballroom. The fire suppression system had stopped, leaving everything dripping with water and scattered with the debris of what had been an elegant corporate event less than an hour before. Dreneth stood among the wreckage, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate, his expression showing something approaching respect for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Impressive," he said, beginning to clap slowly. "Truly impressive. But you've made one critical error, Araval." "What's that?" Lucian asked, positioning himself between Dreneth and Celia while scanning for additional threats. "You've been so focused on protecting Ms. Damar that you haven't been thinking about the bigger picture." Dreneth pulled out a tablet computer and showed Lucian the screen. "While you've been playing hero, my associates have been busy elsewhere." The tablet displayed security camera footage from a residential street in Belltown. Lucian's blood turned to ice as he recognized the house. where Saphira was supposed to be having her sleepover. Armed men were surrounding the building. "Your daughter is a beautiful young lady," Dreneth said with a smile that contained no warmth. "It would be such a tragedy if something happened to her, because her father chose the wrong side in a conflict that doesn't concern him." For the first time since the battle had begun, Lucian felt something that his training couldn't overcome: the paralyzing terror of a parent whose child was in danger. Dreneth had found his weakness, and they both knew it. The tablet screen showed grainy security footage from Emma Caldwell's house in Belltown, where Saphira was supposed to be safe at a sleepover, dreaming of chocolate chip pancakes and weekend adventures. Instead, the feed revealed 4 armed figures moving through the shadows around the modest 2-story home, their positions calculated to control every exit. Lucian's hands trembled for the first time since the battle had begun. The protective fury of a father overwhelming even his special forces training. But it was Celia who spoke first, her voice carrying a steel that matched the Seattle skyscrapers, glittering beyond the shattered windows. "You made a mistake, Colonel," she said, rising from behind the overturned table with her smartphone in hand. "A very big mistake." Dreneth's confident smile faltered slightly. "What mistake would that be, Miss DeMar?" "You assumed this was a private party." Celia held up her phone, showing the screen to everyone in the room. "But we've been broadcasting live to my company's emergency board meeting for the last 20 minutes. Every major news network, the FBI, local law enforcement, and approximately 2 million people on social media have been watching you confess to treason, conspiracy, and the murder of American servicemen." The blood drained from Dreneth's face as the implications hit him. This wasn't a contained operation anymore. It was a public spectacle, being broadcast in real time to audiences around the world. "Moreover," Celia continued, her CEO confidence returning as she seized control of the narrative, "the moment you made threats against that little girl, you activated protocols that I built into Nexus Dynamic Security Systems specifically to protect against situations like this." She tapped her phone screen, and immediately the ballroom's remaining functional displays lit up with tactical information. Building schematics, security camera feeds, and communication intercepts filled the screens, painting a complete picture of Dreneth's operation for everyone to see. "What you're looking at," Celia announced, addressing both the room and the cameras that were still recording, "is evidence of a conspiracy to steal classified American technology, assassinate a U.S. citizen, and sell military secrets to foreign governments. Every communication, every financial transaction, every participant in this operation has been identified and recorded." Lucian was still staring at the footage of the men surrounding his daughter's location, his paternal instincts warring with his tactical training. But Celia's next words stopped his rising panic in its tracks. "The house you're watching, Colonel, isn't where Saphira is tonight. She's been in FBI protective custody since this afternoon, along with the Caldwell family, after our security systems detected the surveillance on their residence." Dreneth's face contorted with fury. "Impossible. My intelligence was perfect." "Your intelligence was fed to you," Celia replied with a smile that could have powered the entire building. "We've known about Jason Kelwick's treachery for 3 weeks. We've been using him to feed false information to your network while we gathered evidence of your entire operation." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Dreneth and his remaining operatives found themselves surrounded by evidence of their own crimes, broadcast live to millions of witnesses, with law enforcement already converging on the building. "You see," Celia continued, her voice gaining strength as she revealed the extent of their preparation, "when you're running a company that develops military AI systems, you learn to think several moves ahead. We knew someone would try to steal our technology eventually. We just didn't know who." Lucian was beginning to understand the scope of what Celia had orchestrated. "You used yourself as bait." "I used my company as bait," she corrected. The Whitmore Summit was designed to draw out whoever was behind the surveillance and infiltration attempts we'd been detecting for months. We needed them to commit to a direct action so we could identify the entire network. Dreneth was backing toward the emergency exits, but the sound of helicopter rotors outside the windows made it clear that escape was no longer an option. Through the glass, the distinctive shapes of FBI tactical helicopters were visible, their searchlights turning the Seattle skyline into day. The little girl's safety was never in question, Celia said, her voice softening as she looked at Lucian. But your reaction to seeing her in apparent danger was the final piece of evidence. We needed to prove that Dreneth's operation was willing to target American families to achieve their goals. The elevator doors opened one final time, but instead of more mercenaries, FBI tactical agents poured into the ballroom. Their weapons were trained not on Lucian and Celia, but on Dreneth and his surviving operatives. Colonel Victor Dreneth, called the lead agent, his voice amplified by his radio system. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit treason, conspiracy to commit murder, violations of the Espionage Act, and approximately 47 other federal crimes that we'll be happy to detail for you during your booking. But even as the handcuffs were being applied, Dreneth was staring at Celia with something approaching admiration. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I founded Nexus Dynamics, Celia replied. When you're building technology that could change the balance of global power, you have to assume that someone will try to steal it. The question was never if, only when and who. Lucian looked around the destroyed ballroom, at the unconscious mercenaries, at the FBI agents securing the scene, at the smartphone still recording everything for social media immortality. So this was all theater? Not theater, Celia corrected. Justice. These people killed your teammates. They were planning to sell technology that could be used to kill more American soldiers. They threatened your daughter to force your compliance. The theater was just the method we used to make sure the whole world saw what they were really capable of. As Dreneth was led away, he called back over his shoulder. This won't stop what's coming, Damar. There are others. More operations, more buyers. You've won a battle, not the war. Maybe, Celia replied. But sometimes one battle is enough to change everything. Outside, the sirens were growing louder as emergency responders secured the building and began processing what would become one of the largest domestic terrorism cases in recent American history. News helicopters joined the FBI aircraft, their cameras capturing footage that would dominate headlines for weeks. But inside the ballroom, amid the wreckage of what had been the most sophisticated corporate espionage operation ever attempted, on American soil, Lucian Orival was thinking about something much simpler: a little girl with a dragon backpack who was safe, and a woman who had risked everything to protect not just her company, but the country they both called home. Safira is really safe? He asked. She's playing video games with two FBI agents who are probably regretting their career choices right about now. Celia replied with the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. The truth was finally coming to light. Broadcast lived to the world, impossible to cover up or explain away. But for Lucian, the most important truth was simpler. Sometimes the right people end up in the right place at the right time. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The Crystal Towers ballroom looked like a disaster zone illuminated by the harsh white lights of crime scene photographers. Shattered glass crunched underfoot as FBI agents methodically documented evidence, their cameras capturing every angle of what would become known as the largest domestic terrorism conspiracy in recent American history. The elegant venue that had hosted Seattle's most prestigious technology summit 12 hours earlier now resembled a war zone, complete with overturned tables, bullet holes in marble walls, and the unconscious forms of mercenaries who had vastly underestimated their opposition. Lucian Orival sat on a medical gurney, his maintenance uniform torn and bloodied, while a paramedic checked a cut above his left eyebrow. despite having single-handedly dismantled a 23-person assassination team. His most serious injury was a shallow laceration from flying glass. The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes and steady hands, kept shaking her head in disbelief as she worked. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, she said, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that made Lucian wince slightly. "I've never seen anything like what happened here tonight. The reports say you took on 24 armed men and walked away with a scratch." "Sometimes you get lucky," Lucian replied, his attention focused not on his injuries, but on the FBI debrief happening across the room. Agent Sarah Chun was interviewing Celia Damar, who, despite her elegant dress being torn and her hair disheveled, still carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to command. The paramedic followed his gaze. "That's some woman. Word. Is she orchestrated this whole thing as a sting operation? Used herself as bait to catch the people trying to steal her company's technology?" Lucian nodded, watching as Celia gestured to the multiple screens that were still displaying evidence of the conspiracy. Even now, hours after the confrontation had ended, she was still fighting, not with weapons, but with data, documentation, and the kind of strategic thinking that had built her company from a garage startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. "Mr. O'Reilly." Agent Chun approached, her badge identifying her as FBI Counterterrorism Division. "I need to ask you a few more questions about your military service and how you ended up in Seattle." "Of course," Lucian replied, accepting a clean shirt from one of the crime scene technicians. "Though I think Ms. Damar has already provided most of the information you need." Agent Chun smiled. "Ms. Damar has provided extensive documentation about the conspiracy and the sting operation. But I'm more interested in the human element of this story. A former Navy SEAL working as a maintenance worker ends up in the right place at the right time to prevent an assassination. That's the kind of coincidence that makes people suspicious." Lucian understood her concern. In the intelligence community, coincidences were usually anything but coincidental. "There was no coincidence." Agent Chun: "I've been working at Crystal Towers for 8 months. Ms. Damar's company has offices on multiple floors of this building. We'd never met before tonight, but I'd been watching the increased security activity around Nexus Dynamics for weeks." "Watching how?" "The way someone with my training notices when patterns change. More visitors staying late, more encrypted communications, more people looking over their shoulders. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew something was building toward a confrontation." Agent Chun made notes in her tablet. "And you just happen to have military-grade equipment in your maintenance toolkit." "I never fully adapted to civilian life," Lucian admitted. "Some habits are harder to break than others. The flashbang grenade, the tactical rope, the combat knife. I kept them because letting go felt like abandoning the people I'd served with who didn't make it home." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that spoke to the invisible wounds that many veterans carried long after their service ended. Agent Chun's expression softened slightly. "The 6 teammates who died in Prague," she sighed, referencing the classified files she'd been reviewing. "Colonel Drenoff's betrayal cost you people you cared about." "It cost America 6 of its best warriors," Lucian corrected. "Martinez had 3 young sons. Thornton was planning to propose to his girlfriend when we got back. Williams was studying for the LSAT because he wanted to become a prosecutor. Davidson had just found out his wife was pregnant with twins. Chun, no relation to you, Agent Chun, was saving money to bring his parents over from Taiwan. Reeves was 2 months away from retirement and a job teaching high school history. Each name carried its own story, its own future that had been cut short by greed and betrayal. Lucian had carried those stories with him for 3 years, along with the guilt of being the survivor who couldn't prevent their deaths. Tonight wasn't about revenge, he continued. It was about making sure that the technology Ms. Damar's team developed to protect American lives doesn't end up being used to take them. Across the room, Celia finished her interview and walked over to where Lucian was sitting. She moved carefully, her high heels navigating the debris-strewn floor with practiced precision. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "I'll be fine," Lucian replied. "How's the damage assessment?" "Surprisingly minimal, considering what happened here," Celia said, gesturing to the destruction around them. "The building's structural integrity is intact. Most of the security systems are still functional, and the evidence we gathered is comprehensive enough to implicate the entire conspiracy network." Agent Chun looked between them. "Ms. Damar, I have to ask, when did you first suspect that Mr. Orival wasn't just a maintenance worker?" Celia smiled, the first genuine warmth Lucian had seen from her all evening. "About 30 seconds after. He intervened in my confrontation with Valentino Ordrich's people. The way he moved, the way he assessed threats, the way he positioned himself to protect me while maintaining situational awareness, that's not something you learn in building maintenance training." "But you didn't know about his Navy SEAL background?" "I suspected military service, but I didn't know the specifics until he told me during the firefight," Celia replied. "What I did know was that I could trust him. There's something about the way truly good people carry themselves that's unmistakable once you learn to recognize it." The compliment made Lucian uncomfortable, but before he could respond, Agent Chun's radio crackled with an update from the command center. "Agent Chun, we've got a situation developing outside. Media presence is massive and growing. Social media. Response to the live stream footage is unlike anything we've seen before. You need to see this." Agent Chun led them to a bank of monitors that had been set up near the ballroom's entrance. The screens showed feeds from news helicopters, street level cameras, and dozens of social media platforms. The hashtags #Crystal Towers Battle, #Maintenance Hero, and #Patriot Defender were trending globally, with millions of people sharing and resharing footage from the evening's events. But it wasn't just the spectacular combat footage that was capturing attention. Someone had isolated and amplified the audio from Lucian's conversation with Agent Chun about his fallen teammates. The moment when he spoke their names, told their stories, honored their memories, that 30-second clip was being shared across every platform, accompanied by tributes from veterans, military families, and ordinary Americans who were moved by his quiet dignity in the face of loss. 15 million views and counting, Agent Chen said, scrolling through the engagement metrics. And that's just on the primary platforms. The story is being picked up by international news organizations, military blogs, technology publications, and human interest programs. Celia studied the screens with the analytical mind that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the technology sector. "This isn't just viral content," she observed. "This is a cultural moment. People aren't just sharing the action sequences. They're sharing the story of sacrifice, service, and standing up for what's right." On one screen, CNN was interviewing military analysts about the tactical precision of Lucian's actions. On another, Fox News was discussing the implications of the technology espionage conspiracy. BBC World was exploring the international ramifications of the failed operation, but the most powerful content wasn't coming from professional media outlets. It was coming from ordinary people who had been moved by different aspects of the story. Veterans were sharing their own stories of service and loss. Parents were talking about the importance of protecting America's technological advantages. Teachers were using the evening's events as examples of moral courage and action. "There's something else," Agent Chun said, switching to a different feed. "This is from the Seattle FBI Field Office press conference that wrapped up about an hour ago." The screen showed FBI Director James Morrison standing behind a podium, flanked by representatives from the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Seattle Police Department. His expression was grave as he addressed a room full of reporters. Tonight's events represent a successful conclusion to a months-long counterintelligence operation designed to identify and neutralize a conspiracy to steal classified American military technology, Morrison said. The conspiracy involved former American military personnel, foreign intelligence services, and corporate entities working together to undermine our national security. A reporter's voice called out from the crowd, "Director Morrison, can you comment on the role of the maintenance worker who single-handedly defeated the assassination team?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. Lucian Orival is a decorated Navy SEAL veteran who served his country with distinction for 8 years. Tonight, he once again answered the call to serve, protecting not just an American citizen, but American technological superiority. His actions exemplify the finest traditions of our military and our nation. The press conference continued, but Lucian had stopped watching. The praise made him uncomfortable, the attention felt overwhelming, and all he really wanted was to go home to his quiet apartment and wake up Sapphira for their traditional Saturday morning pancake breakfast. "This is going to change everything," Celia said quietly, studying his profile. "You understand that, don't you? There's no going back to anonymous maintenance work after tonight." Lucian nodded, understanding the weight of what she was telling him. The comfortable invisibility he'd cultivated for 3 years was gone forever, replaced by a level of public attention that would follow him for the rest of his life. "The question is," Celia continued, "what do you want to do with that change?" Before Lucian could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and smiled for the first time since the evening had begun. The message was from Sapphira. "Dad, I saw you on TV saving people. I'm proud of you. Can we still have pancakes tomorrow?" It was, Lucian realized, the only review that really mattered. Agent Chun approached with a final clipboard of paperwork. "Mr. Orival, we'll need you available for testimony in the coming weeks, but for now you're free to go. There's a car waiting to take you to the safe house where your daughter is staying." "Thank you," Lucian said, signing the documents. As he stood to leave, he turned to Celia. "What happens now? To you, to your company, to all of this?" Celia looked around the destroyed ballroom, then back at him. "Now we rebuild. Stronger than before, and with better security. But more importantly, we remember why we do this work in the first place, which is to protect the people and principles that make America worth defending," she replied. "Tonight reminded me that technology is only as valuable as the people who use it responsibly." As Lucian walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the chaos and the cameras and the constant buzz of a world trying to process what they had witnessed, he carried with him the knowledge that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. But the real consequences of the evening's events were only beginning to unfold, and the most powerful moment was still to come. 3 weeks later, Lucian Orival sat in the passenger seat of Celia DeMar's Tesla, watching the Seattle skyline grow larger through the windshield as they drove back from Sapphira's school. The 8-year-old was in the back seat, chattering excitedly about her science project while wearing a t-shirt that read, "My dad is a real superhero," a gift from her classmates that she'd insisted on wearing despite Lucian's protests. The world had changed dramatically in the week since the Crystal Towers incident. Colonel Victor Dreneth and 17 of his co-conspirators were in federal custody, facing charges that would likely keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Valentino Ordrich's business empire had collapsed overnight when federal investigators froze his assets and revealed the extent of his criminal activities. Jason Kelwick, Celia's former head of security, had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the most significant changes weren't in the criminal justice system. They were in the way America was talking about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes who walked among them every day. The video of Lucian honoring his fallen teammates, had been watched more than 50 million times across all platforms. It had inspired a national conversation about veteran support, military families, and the ongoing costs of America's overseas commitments. Congressional representatives from both parties had cited his words in floor speeches. Military recruitment had increased by 12%. The Navy SEAL Foundation had seen donations triple. "Dad, are you famous now?" Sapphira asked from the back seat, interrupting his thoughts. "I'm not famous, kiddo," Lucian replied. "I'm just someone who did his job. But people keep recognizing you at the grocery store," she pointed out with the inexorable logic of an 8-year-old. "And that reporter lady keeps calling our house." Celia glanced over at him with amusement. "She has a point. That profile piece in Time magazine didn't exactly help with your anonymity goals." Lucian grimaced. The Time magazine article, titled "The Maintenance Man Who Saved America," had featured a photo of him in his work uniform alongside his military portrait from his Navy SEAL days. The contrast between the two images, warrior and civilian, hero and everyday American, had captured the public imagination in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. "I never asked for any of this attention," he said. "No," Celia agreed, "but you deserve it. What you did that night wasn't just about stopping bad guys or protecting classified technology. You reminded people that heroism isn't about wearing a cape or having superpowers. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when it matters most." They pulled into the parking lot of the Seattle Center, where a small crowd had gathered for the afternoon's event. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the cloudy Washington sky. Security barriers had been erected to manage the crowd, and Lucian could see uniformed police officers mingling with what appeared to be plainclothes federal agents. "Are you ready for this?" Celia asked, putting the car in park. Lucian took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." The event was a memorial dedication ceremony for the 6 Navy SEALs who had died in Prague 3 years earlier. After the Crystal Towers incident had brought their story to national attention, Congress had fast-tracked legislation to create a permanent memorial honoring their service. Today's ceremony would unveil that memorial and officially establish the Martinez Thornton Williams Davidson Chen Reeves Foundation for Military Families. As they walked toward the ceremony site, Lucian was amazed by the diversity of the crowd that had gathered. There were veterans in dress uniforms, military families holding photos of loved ones, technology workers from Seattle's thriving industry, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the story of sacrifice and service. Near the memorial site, Lucian spotted familiar faces from that night 3 weeks ago. Agent Sarah Chun was there in a crisp FBI windbreaker, coordinating security with local law enforcement. Several of the Crystal Towers guests who had witnessed the confrontation were in attendance, including some who had filmed the critical moments that had gone viral. But it was the group standing near the memorial itself that made Lucian's throat tight with emotion. 6 families stood together, holding photographs of the men who would never come home. Maria Martinez clutched a picture of her husband in his dress blues, their 3 young sons standing solemnly beside her. Jennifer Thornton wore the engagement ring that her fiancé had planned to give her after the Prague mission. The Williams family had flown in from Ohio, their teenage daughter wearing her father's Navy SEAL pin on her jacket. The Davidson twins, now 3 years old, clung to their mother's hands while she held their father's portrait. Chun's elderly parents had traveled from Taiwan, their faces etched with pride and sorrow. And Margaret Reeves, who would have been celebrating her 45th wedding anniversary this month, stood with quiet dignity beside a photo of the man who had planned to teach history to high school students. "I can't do this," Lucian whispered to Celia as they approached the families. "I should have been with them. I should have been able to save them." Celia stopped walking and turned to face him. "Lucian, look at me. Those men died because Victor Dreneth betrayed them for money. Their deaths weren't your fault, but their sacrifice matters because you survived to tell their story. Because you lived to honor their memory. Because you were here to stop the same kind of evil that killed them from succeeding again. Before Lucian could respond, Maria Martinez approached them. She was a small woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, wearing a black dress and carrying a folded American flag. "You're Lucian Orival," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion. In her eyes, "Yes, ma'am," Lucian replied, his military bearing returning automatically in the presence of a Gold Star widow. "My husband talked about you in his letters," Maria said. "He said you were the kind of leader who brought everyone home safely. He trusted you with his life." Lucian felt tears building behind his eyes. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry. I failed. I failed all of them." Maria Martinez shook her head firmly. "You didn't fail anyone. You carried their memory with you for 3 years, and when you had the chance to honor their sacrifice by protecting other people, you did exactly what they would have done. You made their deaths mean something." She handed him the folded flag. This was draped on Roberto's coffin. "I want you to have it, because you're the one who made sure their story was finally told." The weight of the flag in his hands felt like the weight of responsibility, memory, and honor all combined. Around the memorial site, the other families were watching with understanding and approval. Jennifer Thornton stepped forward. "David always said that the teams were his brotherhood. That meant taking care of each other's families if something happened. You've been taking care of all of us by making sure people remember what they died for." The ceremony began with a military honor guard presenting the colors, followed by remarks from the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the FBI, and several members of Congress. But when it came time for Lucian to speak, the crowd of several thousand people fell into complete silence. He approached the podium slowly, the folded flag still in his hands, Safira holding his free hand as they walked together to the microphone. When he looked out at the crowd, he saw faces of every age and background, united by their respect for service and sacrifice. 3 weeks ago, Lucian began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "A lot of people called me a hero for doing my job. But I want you to know who the real heroes are." He gestured to the memorial behind him, where 6 bronze plaques displayed the names, photographs, and service records of the fallen SEALs. Roberto Martinez grew up in East LA, joined the Navy to pay for college, and stayed because he found a family in the teams. He sent half his paycheck home to his parents and coached Little League every summer he wasn't deployed. He died protecting American assets and American lives in Prague, betrayed by someone he trusted. The crowd listened in absolute silence as Lucian told each man's story, not just their military service, but their dreams, their families, their plans for the future that would never be realized. David Thornton had already picked out the ring. He carried a photo of Jennifer in his helmet for 3 deployments. He died 6 months before he planned to propose, betrayed by someone he trusted. One by one, Lucian honored each fallen warrior, his voice never wavering despite the tears that were streaming down his face and the faces of thousands of people in the audience. Michael Williams wanted to be a prosecutor because he believed in justice. He died fighting for American interests, betrayed by someone he trusted. The repetition of "betrayed by someone he trusted" became a refrain that hammered home the particular evil of what Victor Dreneth had done. James Davidson never got to meet his twins. He died protecting American operations overseas, betrayed by someone he trusted. Wei Chun sent money home to Taiwan every month to support his parents. He died serving his adopted country, betrayed by someone he trusted. Robert Reeves had 30 days left on his final deployment. He died 2 months before retirement, betrayed by someone he trusted. When Lucian finished speaking, the silence was absolute. Thousands of people stood motionless, many weeping openly. all understanding that they had witnessed something profound and unrepeatable. Then Saphira stepped forward to the microphone. "My dad taught me that heroes aren't the people who win," she said, her 8-year-old voice carrying with startling clarity. "Heroes are the people who protect others, even when it's scary, even when it's hard, even when nobody will ever know about it." She looked out at the crowd with the seriousness that young people bring to important moments. "These soldiers were heroes because they protected people. My dad is a hero because he protected people. But the biggest heroes are the families who keep loving and remembering, even when it hurts." She turned to the Gold Star family standing near the memorial. "Thank you for sharing your heroes with all of us." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the sight of hardened military veterans, openly weeping, that would dominate the news coverage and social media posts for days to come. Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and the news crews packed up their equipment, Lucian sat on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay with Celia and Saphira. The Seattle skyline glittered across the water, and the memorial behind them was illuminated by spotlights that would keep it visible throughout the night. "What happens now?" Celia asked, echoing the question she had posed 3 weeks earlier. "In the destroyed ballroom. Now we go home," Lucian said. "We have pancakes for dinner because it's Saturday, and that's what we always do on Saturday. Saphira finishes her science project. I help her with her math homework. We watch a movie and eat too much popcorn." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow I start my new job as Director of Security for Nexus Dynamics," Lucian replied. "I help you build systems that protect American technology and American lives. I make sure that what happened to my teammates never happens to anyone else's teammates." Celia smiled. "And the fame? The media attention? The speaking requests? I'll do what I need to do to honor their memory," Lucian said, looking back at the memorial. "But at the end of the day, I'm still just a single dad who wants to raise his daughter to understand the difference between right and wrong." Saphira looked up from the tablet where she had been drawing pictures of the memorial ceremony. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course, kiddo." "Are you sad that you're not invisible anymore?" Lucian considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. Anonymity had been his shield, invisibility his protection against a world that demanded more than he thought he had to give. But watching the Gold Star families find comfort in finally having their loved ones' stories told, seeing young veterans approach him at the grocery store to thank him for representing them with dignity, knowing that Saphira was growing up understanding that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, all of that had changed his perspective. "No, sweetheart," he said finally. "I'm not sad about it anymore. Sometimes the most important job you can do is the one you never wanted." As they walked back to the car, Lucian's phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chun. "Final update. On the Dreneth case, all co-conspirators have been sentenced. Technology transfer was completely prevented. Mission accomplished." But as Lucian looked at his daughter skipping ahead of them, chattering about her plans to dedicate her science project to the 6 heroes they had honored today, he knew the real mission was just beginning. The mission of raising the next generation to understand that heroism wasn't about recognition or rewards. It was about standing up for what was right, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and honoring the sacrifices of those who came before. 3 weeks after a maintenance worker became a reluctant hero, Lucian Araval was finally at peace with the man he had always been, and the father he was becoming. The story that had begun with hidden identities and corporate espionage had become something much more powerful, a reminder that in America, heroes walked among us every day, and that the most profound acts of service often came from the most unlikely places. As the Seattle skyline faded behind them, and they drove home to their quiet apartment in Belltown, Lucian carried with him the knowledge that some stories end not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and love preserved. The pancakes could wait. Tonight, they would order pizza and watch a movie, and Sapphira would fall asleep on the couch with her head on his shoulder, safe in the knowledge that her father was exactly the hero she had always believed him to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.